The crystal shattered against the marble floor, and with it, something deeper than glass broke inside her chest. Lady Evangeline's voice echoed through the conservatory like a blade dragging across stone, each word a calculated wound designed to strip away what little dignity remained. The orphan girl stood motionless among the scattered fragments, her breath visible in the sudden cold that seemed to pour from the windows themselves. Blood welled from a tiny cut on her palm where she had tried to catch the falling piece, a futile gesture that now marked her as both servant and sacrifice. The scent of winter roses hung heavy in the air, their thorns sharp as accusations, while somewhere in the shadows beyond the doorway, footsteps approached with the measured pace of inevitable judgment. Before we dive into the story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The morning had begun like so many others at Ravenshollow Manor, with the orphan girl rising before dawn to tend fires that never seemed to warm the stone corridors. Her name was Celeste, though few bothered to use it. She was simply the foundling to most, or that girl, when they felt generous. The rough wool of her servant's dress scratched against skin that had learned to expect discomfort as naturally as breathing. Her fingers, already reddened from the cold, worked methodically to coax flame from reluctant kindling, each spark a small victory against the perpetual chill that lived in the walls of this ancient house. She had been brought here as a child, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of rain and abandonment, left at the gates with nothing but a note pinned to her chest, for the mercy of God and the kindness of strangers. The Countess of Ravenshollow had taken her in, not from compassion, but from the peculiar vanity of being seen as charitable. Celeste became a living ornament to her benefactor's virtue, a walking testimony to noble generosity that could be displayed at will and dismissed just as easily. The conservatory glass caught the weak winter light and scattered it across the floor in patterns that reminded Celeste of broken promises. She moved through her duties with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny always led to punishment. The other servants watched her with the wary distance reserved for those who occupied an uncertain place in the household hierarchy, neither family nor true servant, but something uncomfortably in between. It was Lady Evangeline who had summoned her that morning, her voice carrying the particular tone that preceded entertainment at someone else's expense. The Countess's niece had arrived for an extended visit, bringing with her a collection of fine dresses, sharper opinions, and an appetite for cruelty that dressed itself in the language of improvement. She had taken particular interest in Celeste, studying her with the intensity of a naturalist examining an interesting specimen. "Come here, foundling," Lady Evangeline commanded from her position near the windows, where the light caught the gold threads in her morning dress. "I wish to examine your deportment. It has been reported to me that you carry yourself with inappropriate dignity for one of your station." Celeste approached with measured steps, her hands clasped before her in the posture she had been taught years ago. The conservatory felt smaller with Lady Evangeline in it, as if her presence consumed the very air. Plants that had flourished under the Countess's care seemed to wilt slightly in the young woman's vicinity, their leaves curling inward as if seeking protection. "You walk as though you believe yourself equal to your betters," Lady Evangeline continued, circling Celeste with predatory grace. "There is something in your bearing that suggests presumption. It disturbs me greatly." The crystal figurine, a delicate swan that had belonged to the late Count, sat on the table between them like a silent witness. Lady Evangeline lifted it with careless fingers, holding it up to the light where it cast rainbows across the wall. The beauty of the moment felt obscene, given what Celeste sensed was coming. "Tell me, foundling, what do you imagine your future holds? Do you harbor foolish dreams of rising above your circumstances, of perhaps catching the eye of some gentleman who might mistake your robust constitution for charm?" The words hung in the air like poison. Celeste kept her eyes downcast, but her silence seemed to inflame Lady Evangeline further. The young woman's voice rose, taking on the shrill edge of someone accustomed to having her cruelties applauded. "Answer me when I speak to you. Or have you grown so proud that you believe yourself above responding to your superiors?" It was then that Celeste made the mistake of lifting her eyes. For just a moment, the mask of submission slipped, revealing something that Lady Evangeline recognized and despised, dignity that could not be taken, only abandoned. In that brief exchange of gazes, war was declared without words. Lady Evangeline's hand opened. The crystal swan fell, turning slowly in the light as it plummeted toward the marble floor. Celeste moved instinctively, reaching out to catch something that was already lost, and felt the sharp edge slice across her palm as the figurine shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. "Clumsy creature," Lady Evangeline said with satisfaction, as if she had proven some essential point about the natural order of things. "Look what your presumption has wrought. That belonged to my uncle, and now it lies in ruins because of your overreaching." Blood dripped steadily from Celeste's wounded hand, each drop a small scarlet star against the white marble. She pressed her fingers closed around the cut, feeling the warm wetness seep between them. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the deeper ache of injustice that lodged itself beneath her ribs like a stone. Other servants had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the sound of breaking glass and raised voices. Their faces showed the careful blankness of people who understood their position in the world's food chain. They would not intervene, they could not afford to. Celeste saw her own isolation reflected in their downcast eyes and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You will clean this mess," Lady Evangeline continued, her voice now honeyed with false regret. "And you will do so on your hands and knees, as befits someone who has destroyed something precious through carelessness. Perhaps the posture will remind you of your proper place." It was as Celeste knelt among the crystal fragments, her blood mixing with the scattered pieces, that she heard the footsteps. They came from the direction of the main hall, measured and unhurried, carrying with them a presence that seemed to change the very quality of light in the room. The servants in the doorway parted without being asked, their bodies responding to an authority they felt before they saw its source. Lord Adrian Blackthorne entered the conservatory like winter given human form. He was the Countess's distant cousin, rarely seen at Ravenshollow but spoken of in whispers that carried equal parts fear and fascination. His hair was dark as the space between stars, and his eyes held the pale intensity of ice just before it cracks. When he moved, shadows seemed to follow him, not cast by light but drawn by some magnetic pull that belonged to him alone. The gathered servants pressed themselves against the doorframe, as Lord Blackthorne surveyed the scene with the detached interest of someone accustomed to finding the world arranged for his convenience. His gaze moved from Lady Evangeline's flushed face to the kneeling figure of Celeste surrounded by broken crystal, and the silence stretched until it became a living thing, pressing against the walls and making everyone acutely aware of their own breathing. "How theatrical," he said finally, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who chose his words with the precision of a surgeon choosing instruments. "Though I confess I'm uncertain whether this is tragedy or farce." Lady Evangeline's confidence wavered for the first time since Celeste had known her. "Cousin Adrian, I was merely correcting an impertinence. The foundling has grown quite above herself and needed reminding of her place." Lord Blackthorne moved closer to where Celeste knelt, his boots soundless against the marble despite their obvious weight. She could feel the cold that emanated from him, as if winter itself had taken human shape to walk among the living. When he spoke again, his words seemed to fall like snow, each one distinct and perfectly formed. "Rise," he said to Celeste, and something in his tone made disobedience impossible. She stood slowly, her wounded hand still pressed against her side, leaving small dark stains on the rough fabric of her dress. When she lifted her head to meet his eyes, she found herself looking into depths that seemed to hold the memory of every winter that had ever been. The conservatory held its breath. Even the plants seemed to lean inward, as if trying to hear what judgment would fall from lips that rarely bothered with speech at all. Lord Blackthorne extended his hand towards Celeste's wounded palm, not touching but hovering close enough that she could feel the chill radiating from his skin. "Show me," he commanded quietly. Celeste unclenched her fingers with reluctance, revealing the cut that ran across her palm like a red river through pale landscape. Blood welled fresh in the exposed air, and she felt a moment of dizziness that had nothing to do with the wound itself. Lord Blackthorne studied the injury with the focus of someone reading scripture, his pale eyes tracing the line of broken skin as if it contained some message meant only for him. "Interesting," he murmured, though what he found interesting remained a secret. He lifted his gaze to Lady Evangeline, who had grown progressively paler during this exchange. "You seem to have mistaken destruction for discipline, cousin." The distinction, while subtle, is rather important. The rebuke was delivered with such quiet authority that it hit Lady Evangeline like a physical blow. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, a fish gasping in air too thin to sustain it. The servants in the doorway shifted nervously, sensing the change in atmospheric pressure that preceded storms. "The foundling will come with me," Lord Blackthorn continued, his decision falling like a blade through the tension. "She requires proper attention for her injury, and I find myself in need of someone with steady hands for certain delicate tasks." It was not a request. Lady Evangeline's protests died in her throat before they could achieve sound, withering under the weight of an authority that brooked no contradiction. Celeste felt the world tilt around her, as if the conservatory floor had become the deck of a ship in heavy seas. Everything she thought she understood about her place in the world was being rewritten by forces beyond her comprehension. "Gather your things," Lord Blackthorn said to her, his voice carrying the finality of winter settling over the land. "What few possessions you have. We leave within the hour." As Celeste moved toward the door on unsteady legs, she felt the assembled servants' eyes upon her like weights. Some watched with envy, others with pity, and a few with the hollow recognition of those who had themselves been rearranged by powers greater than their understanding. The conservatory, which had been her prison moments before, now felt like a sanctuary she was being forced to abandon. But it was Lady Evangeline's expression that would haunt her in the days to come, the look of someone who had been playing a game she thought she understood, only to discover that the rules had been changed without her knowledge. The crystal fragments still glittered on the marble floor like fallen stars, beautiful and sharp and impossible to make whole again. As Lord Blackthorn's shadow fell across the threshold, the conservatory seemed to exhale, releasing breath it had been holding since his arrival. And in that moment of release, Celeste understood that whatever came next would be unlike anything she had known before. The morning's certainties had shattered as completely as the crystal swan, leaving her to navigate a landscape where mercy and menace wore the same pale face. The east wing of Raven's Hollow Manor stretched before them like a corridor carved from midnight itself. Lord Blackthorn moved through the shadows with the ease of someone for whom darkness was a native language, while Celeste followed at a distance that felt both respectful and necessary for survival. Her small bundle of possessions, a spare dress, a prayer book with pages soft as cloth, and the wooden comb that had been her mother's only gift, pressed against her ribs with each step. The walls here were different from the rest of the manor, older somehow, as if they had been standing when the world was younger and more willing to believe in things that defied explanation. Portraits lined the hallway, their subjects watching the procession with eyes that seemed to track movement across centuries. Celeste felt their gaze like cold fingers tracing her spine, and she pulled her shawl tighter around shoulders that had learned to expect the worst from any sudden change in circumstance. "You're wondering why?" Lord Blackthorn said without turning around, his voice carrying clearly despite the way sound seemed to be absorbed by the ancient stones. "It's written in your posture, the careful distance you maintain, the way your breathing has grown shallow with uncertainty." Celeste said nothing, having learned long ago that silence was often the safest response to observations she didn't understand. But her steps faltered slightly, betraying the truth of his words. The wound on her palm had stopped bleeding, but it throbbed with a persistence that made her acutely aware of her own pulse. "The crystal swan," he continued, pausing before a door whose wood was so dark it seemed to drink light rather than reflect it, "belonged to my great-uncle Edmund. He commissioned it from a craftsman in Venice, a man who claimed he could capture souls in glass." Lord Blackthorn's pale eyes found hers in the dim corridor. Whether that was true, or merely artisans boasting, we shall never know. Lady Evangeline saw to that. The key he produced was unlike any Celeste had seen, wrought iron twisted into patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if the metal itself had been persuaded into shapes that geometry should not allow. When it turned in the lock, the mechanism sang with a sound like wind through empty churches. The room beyond took Celeste's breath and held it captive. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings creating a tapestry of burgundy and gold and midnight blue. But these were not the decorative volumes that graced the manor's public rooms. These books showed signs of being read, their spines creased with handling, their pages heavy with secrets that had been whispered into being over countless nights. A fire burned in the hearth despite the absence of any servant to tend it, casting dancing shadows that made the text on the nearest shelf seem to writhe and shift. The air smelled of parchment and ink and something else, something that reminded Celeste of the moment just before lightning strikes, when the world holds its breath in anticipation of illumination. "This will be your domain," Lord Blackthorne said, moving to a desk whose surface was covered with papers written in scripts that seemed to bend light around their edges. "You will tend the books, preserve the manuscripts, and assist me in certain scholarly pursuits that require discretion above all else." Celeste found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. "My lord, I can read, but I have no training in the care of volumes such as these. Surely someone with proper education would serve you better." He turned to face her fully, and in the firelight his features took on an otherworldly quality that made her understand why the servants spoke of him only in whispers. "Education," he said, with a slight smile that held no warmth, "is often nothing more than the systematic replacement of wonder with certainty. You, I suspect, still possess the former." From the desk, he lifted a book bound in leather, so pale it might have been made from moonlight itself. When he opened it, the pages revealed text written in silver ink that seemed to move across the parchment like living mercury. Celeste felt her wounded hand grow cold as ice. The cut throbbing in rhythm with words she could not read but somehow understood carried weight beyond their meaning. "There are libraries," Lord Blackthorne said quietly, "and then there are repositories of things that were never meant to be forgotten. This room contains both." He closed the book with a sound like winter settling over the world. "Your injury this morning was fortuitous. The blood of someone who has suffered unjustly carries certain properties that prove useful in the preservation of delicate texts." The words should have frightened her. Instead, Celeste felt something that might have been recognition stirring in the deepest chambers of her heart. All her life, she had felt like a piece of a puzzle that belonged to no picture she could see, a word in a language no one around her spoke. Here, surrounded by books that breathed secrets, and tended by a man who spoke to shadows, she began to sense the possibility of belonging. The education began before dawn, when the world still wore the soft, gray mask of uncertainty that preceded true morning. Celeste woke to find a woman sitting in the chair beside her bed, not a servant, but something else entirely. She was neither young nor old, her age seeming to shift with the light like her features, which held an otherworldly quality that made Celeste's eyes water if she tried to focus on them too directly. "The books sleep differently than we do," the woman said by way of greeting, her voice carrying the particular quality that belonged to those who spoke truths others were not ready to hear. "They dream in languages that predate speech, and their dreams seep into the minds of those who spend too much time among them. You will learn to recognize the difference between your own thoughts and theirs." The woman introduced herself as Morwen, and her smile revealed teeth that were perhaps too sharp to be entirely natural. "Come, child," she said, her voice like wind chimes made of bone. "Lord Blackthorne awaits, and the learning goes easier in daylight." The library in the early morning possessed an entirely different character than it had the day before. The fire still burned without apparent fuel, but its light now revealed details that had been hidden in the afternoon shadows. The books arranged themselves not by size or subject, but by some more esoteric principle that made perfect sense without being explicable. Lord Blackthorne stood at the tall windows, his pale hair catching what little light managed to penetrate the winter clouds. He held a cup from which steam rose in patterns too complex to be mere vapor, and when he turned to acknowledge their arrival, Celeste saw that his eyes held the particular intensity that belonged to those who had spent the night hours in communion with secrets. "The first lesson," he said without preamble, "concerns the difference between reading and comprehension. Most people move their eyes across symbols and believe they have absorbed meaning. True reading requires the participation of blood and breath, the willingness to let the text change you as much as you interpret it." He gestured toward the desk, where the pale leather volume lay open, its silver text now perfectly still in the morning light. Beside it sat a small crystal bowl filled with water, so clear it seemed like concentrated transparency, and a quill whose feather was darker than midnight. "Your scar," Lord Blackthorne continued, his gaze moving to Celeste's bandaged palm, "will serve as more than a key. It will become a translation device, allowing you to read texts that communicate through pain rather than pleasure, through sacrifice rather than comfort. Moen approached the desk with steps that made no sound against the stone floor. From somewhere within her robes, she produced a small silver knife whose blade was so sharp it seemed to cut light itself as it moved. "The ritual is ancient," she said, her bone-chime voice taking on the cadence of ceremony. "Older than the manor, older than the family that built it." Celeste felt fear flutter in her chest like a caged bird, but beneath it lay something stronger, a curiosity that had been awakened by yesterday's transformation and now demanded to be fed. She extended her wounded hand without being asked, watching as Morwen carefully removed the bandages to reveal skin that had knitted itself together with surprising speed. The scar was exactly as Lord Blackthorn had predicted, a thin silver line that caught the firelight and seemed to pulse with its own subtle rhythm. When Morwen pressed the edge of the blade against it, the healed flesh parted as easily as if it had been waiting for this moment, and blood welled bright as rubies against her pale palm. "Now," Lord Blackthorn said softly, "let 3 drops fall into the water." The blood struck the crystal bowl with sounds like tiny bells ringing in distant chambers. Where each drop touched the surface, the water bloomed with color, not red, but silver and gold and deep blue, patterns that spread and merged and created new patterns in an endless dance of meaning. "Place your hand upon the page," Morwen instructed, guiding Celeste's bleeding palm to rest against the open book. The moment her skin touched the parchment, the world exploded into sensation. The silver text rose from the page like living things, wrapping around her fingers and streaming up her arm in ribbons of cold fire. Words poured into her mind, not through her eyes, but through every pore of her skin, every nerve ending suddenly awakened to frequencies she had never imagined. She saw cities that had never been built, carved from materials that existed only in the spaces between heartbeats. She walked through libraries where the books read their readers, absorbing the knowledge of everyone who opened them. She felt the weight of secrets that had shaped history from shadows, the presence of powers that moved through the world disguised as coincidence and natural law. When the visions finally receded, she found herself supported by Morwen's surprisingly strong arms, her legs having given way beneath the weight of all she had experienced. The book lay closed upon the desk, its silver text once again perfectly still, but she could feel its contents now living inside her mind like a second heartbeat. "The first text always leaves the deepest impression," Lord Blackthorn said, his voice coming from what seemed like a great distance. "Your mind is creating new pathways to accommodate what it has absorbed." The grand salon had been transformed into a tribunal masquerading as a social gathering. Lady Evangeline held court from the central settee, her spine rigid with righteous indignation and her voice pitched to carry maximum effect. Around her clustered the flowers of local nobility, Lady Pemberton with her calculating eyes, Lord Ashworth whose gambling debts made him eager to curry favor, and the Dowager Countess of Whitmore, whose moral pronouncements carried the weight of someone who had never been tested by genuine adversity. They had been summoned, these arbiters of propriety, to witness what Lady Evangeline termed a shocking breach of natural order. The fact that Lord Blackthorn rarely attended such gatherings and never submitted to judgment from social inferiors had apparently escaped her tactical considerations. "The foundling has been elevated far beyond her station," Lady Evangeline declared, her voice carrying the particular shrillness that accompanied genuine outrage. "Installed in chambers that properly belong to family members, given responsibilities that require breeding and education she simply does not possess." Lady Pemberton nodded with the vigor of someone whose own secrets made her eager to focus attention elsewhere. "Such disruptions of the natural hierarchy benefit no one," she agreed. "The girl will be made miserable by expectations she cannot meet." The assembled worthies murmured agreement like a Greek chorus trained in the art of socially acceptable assassination. They spoke of precedent and propriety, of the dangers inherent in elevating the lowborn beyond their natural capacities. It was into this atmosphere of perfumed malice that Lord Blackthorn made his entrance, and his arrival transformed the room as surely as winter transforms landscape. Conversations died mid-syllable. Teacups paused halfway to lips. The very air seemed to grow thinner, as if his presence demanded more space than physics typically allowed. Behind him, at a distance that suggested respect rather than servitude, walked Celeste. She had been transformed by more than fine clothing. though the midnight blue dress that Morwen had selected did indeed make her appear as something other than the foundling who had knelt among crystal fragments. Her bearing carried the particular gravity that belonged to those who had looked into depths others feared to acknowledge. "How delightful," Lord Blackthorn said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "A gathering of concerned citizens, united in their dedication to the preservation of natural order." Lady Evangeline's confidence wavered, but she pressed forward with the determination of someone who had committed herself to a course of action and lacked the wisdom to retreat. "We have come to discuss a matter of household management that affects us all. The elevation of unsuitable persons to positions of trust, unsuitable." He repeated the word as if tasting wine that had turned to vinegar. "A fascinating choice of terminology. Pray, elaborate on the standards by which suitability is measured in your particular philosophy." The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that made the assembled nobles shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Lady Evangeline's color rose, but she pressed forward. "Birth," she declared, as if the single word contained all the moral authority needed to win any argument. "Education, breeding, the qualities that distinguish those fit to hold positions of responsibility." Lord Blackthorn's smile deepened, and the temperature in the room dropped by degrees that could be felt if not measured. "How illuminating! And tell me, Lady Evangeline, which of these qualifications enabled you to destroy a priceless artifact through petty malice disguised as moral instruction?" The accusation struck the gathering like lightning illuminating a landscape previously hidden by darkness. Several of the assembled guests leaned forward, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple dispute over household arrangements. "I was correcting an impertinence," Lady Evangeline replied, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. The foundling presumed to carry herself with inappropriate dignity. "Humility." Lord Blackthorn moved closer to where she sat, and his approach caused others to unconsciously lean away. "You speak as one well-versed in the virtue. Perhaps you would demonstrate by explaining to our assembled friends the precise nature of your own qualifications for administering such instruction." It was then that Celeste stepped forward, moving with the fluid grace that belonged to those who had learned to navigate currents invisible to ordinary perception. The knowledge absorbed from ancient texts whispered guidance, showing her the precise words needed to transform accusation into revelation. "You speak of burdens," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed salon, as one intimately familiar with their weight. "Perhaps you could share with our assembled friends the particular burden you carry, the one that makes you so eager to distribute suffering among those less capable of defending themselves." The words struck the gathering like a physical blow, not because they were loud or crude, but because they were delivered with the particular authority that belonged to those who spoke from knowledge rather than assumption. Lady Evangeline's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping in air too thin to sustain life. Around her, the assembled nobles began to recognize that they had gathered to witness not a judgment, but an execution, their own moral authority systematically dismantled by forces they had assumed were safely beneath their notice. The confrontation continued until, one by one, the assembled worthies found urgent business elsewhere. Lady Pemberton was the first to retreat, followed by Lord Ashworth, and finally the Dowager Countess. Only Lady Evangeline remained, trapped by her own declarations and the social momentum that had seemed so powerful moments before. The weeks that followed brought a strange peace to Ravenshollow Manor. Lady Evangeline had departed without ceremony, claiming urgent business elsewhere that required her immediate attention. The other guests had scattered like leaves before autumn wind, each carrying with them the uncomfortable awareness that they had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the world. Celeste's education deepened with each passing day. The library revealed new sections that had been hidden behind doors that materialized at Lord Blackthorn's touch. She learned to read documents written in languages that predated speech, to interpret maps of countries that existed only when viewed from certain angles. The scar on her palm had become more than a key. It was now a compass that pointed toward truths hidden in plain sight. Her transformation was becoming visible even to those who lacked sensitivity to otherworldly forces. She moved with new authority, spoke with certainty that came from knowledge rather than assumption. The servants treated her with respect that bordered on reverence, sensing that she had crossed thresholds they could not see but somehow understood marked her as fundamentally changed. One evening, as winter gave way to the first hints of spring, Celeste stood in the library surrounded by books that whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Through the tall windows, she could see the gardens where new growth was beginning to emerge from soil that had been frozen for months. The sight filled her with something that might have been hope, though the emotion felt different now, deeper, more complex, weighted with responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. Lord Blackthorn appeared beside her with the silent presence that characterized his movements. "You have learned well," he said, his voice carrying approval that meant more than she had expected. "The knowledge you now carry makes you valuable beyond measure to those who understand its worth." Celeste looked down at her hands, unmarked now, but forever changed by the blood she had shed in service of truths that most people feared to acknowledge. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be as complex as everything else she had learned in this room. "Now," he said, his pale eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain starlight, "you take your place among those who guard the boundaries between what is known and what must remain hidden. There are others like us, scattered throughout the world, preserving knowledge that could reshape reality if it ever fell into unprepared hands." The responsibility settled upon her shoulders like a cloak woven from duty and purpose. She thought of the crystal swan that had shattered against marble, of Lady Evangeline's cruelty that had unknowingly served as the catalyst for transformation beyond anything she could have imagined. The morning's humiliation had become the foundation for an existence that transcended the limitations she had once accepted as immutable. Through the windows, the first stars appeared in a sky that was growing dark with the approach of true night. But in the library, where books dreamed of forgotten truths and shadows served purposes beyond mere absence of light, Celeste felt no fear of the darkness. She had learned to read by the light of knowledge itself, to find her way through territories that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. The education was complete, the guardian was ready, and somewhere in the depths of the ancient manor, new stories were beginning to write themselves in texts that would someday require their own special reader, their own willing sacrifice, their own transformation from victim into vessel for truths too powerful for the unprepared mind to contain. The scar might have healed, but the mark it left upon her soul would guide her through adventures yet to come, in a world where the line between reality and possibility grew thinner with each page. She learned to read with her heart instead of her eyes. Yenny, if this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts in us is what most makes us human.